So, all we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given to us. This advice comes from the wise wizard Gandalf, and I'm going to take his advice and this time to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien and his well-known book series, The Lord of the Rings. It was published in 1954 and 1955, which is more than 50 years ago. This series has essentially laid out the groundwork for the countless fantasy works that have followed it. His ideas, characters, and themes were defining enough to be the inspiration for innumerable authors, including many that are writing today. The Lord of the Rings is part of the literary genre of fantasy, which is generally defined as stories that use magic, adventure, and the supernatural as some of their major themes. The tales are often set in an imaginary world, like how The Lord of the Rings is set in Middle-earth, which is similar to our Earth, but with a few more fantastical creatures. The fantasy genre has become a major part of today's literary scene, with thousands of books published every year. Each one has a new and unique story with different ideas and characters. However, so many of these books relate almost directly back to J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Where did he get his inspiration? One of his sources appears to be Nordic culture. Many of the creatures that are prominent in the Lord of the Rings series were present in Norse mythology. Elves, dwarves, and dragons originate from and inhabit the many Nordic worlds. As another example, the Grey Wizard Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings bears a strong resemblance to Odin the Allfather, a god in Norse mythology. Another influence that Tolkien drew from was language. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, also known as Old English, and he translated the ancient story Beowulf during his time spent as a studying professor at the University of Oxford. He developed several languages from Middle-earth, his finest being Elvish, which he worked on for most of his life. With all of its history, language, and lore, the depth of the Lord of the Rings goes well beyond the books, but the series itself still has many influential themes and elements. The fundamental theme that I've found throughout the series is the conflict between good and evil. This theme has been present much before Tolkien's time, but he was able to use it in such a way that he almost defined what it means. Nearly every character in The Lord of the Rings can be clearly defined as either good or evil. Usually this is shown through the creature or person's intentions, who they answer to, or who they get along with. It's very, very rare that you can tell who's evil just by looking at them. This affects the series by simplifying the storyline a bit. There's little to no worrying about each character's moral ground, and there are very few conflicts of, is this character on our side? Our heroes are clearly heroes, and their enemies are evil and want to destroy everything. This theme has embedded itself in the fantasy genre. Some examples include the Wheel of Time series, written by Robert Jordan in 1990. This follows a group of characters who fight against a devil-like evil lord on behalf of the good of the world. In the Darkest Rising sequence by Susan Cooper in 1984, the main characters take part in a war between the forces of the light and the dark. With this theme so common, it can definitely feel overused at points. George R.R. Martin, the author of the extremely popular series Game of Thrones, argues that very few people in any world can be called clearly good or bad, and that we mainly live in a gray or undecided moral world. This standpoint can be found in a few Lord of the Rings characters, however, who blur the lines a bit. But for the most part, Tolkien's characters remain on one side or the other. The next theme that's prominent in The Lord of the Rings is that of the quest. The most well-known use of this is the Odyssey by Homer in ancient Greece. This follows the hero Odysseus as he travels across the Mediterranean. One of the storylines throughout The Lord of the Rings follows the characters Frodo and Samwise Gamgee as they journey across Middle-earth. This part of the story gets to explore and experience the magnificent world Tolkien created and many of the creatures and places that the two come across. An example of this theme used in another book is The Sword of Shannara, written by Terry Brooks 23 years after The Lord of the Rings was published. In this book, the character Shay travels across the world with his companions to defeat the Skull King, the evil lord of their world, which sounds pretty similar to Frodo and his journey against Sauron. The last major theme I want to point out is the unlikely hero. In both The Lord of the Rings and the novel The Hobbit before it, the main character is a hobbit, Frodo and Bilbo Baggins respectively. Hobbits, otherwise known as halflings, live in a corner of the world that they call the Shire. It's a very peaceful place, well away from the sorts of evil that inhabit the rest of Middle-earth. These hobbits generally disapprove of having any sort of adventure or step out of routine and prefer to focus on the important things in life, such as breakfast, second breakfast, 11sies, lunch and afternoon tea, supper, and dinner. They severely disapprove of any adventure into the unknown world, and when one not only leaves the Shire and his cozy home, but faces dragons, orcs, goblins, and wolves, it's extremely divergent from the usual behavior of your average hobbit. This theme has found its place in other fantasy novels as well. In the Inheritance Cycle, written by Christopher Paolini, the farm boy Aragorn, who lives in a small town away from the rest of the world, finds a dragon egg and proceeds to take on the Empire and its evil emperor. Moving away from themes, The Lord of the Rings was an inspiration for many types of media outside of literature. The most well-known being the 6 film adaptations created by Peter Jackson of The Hobbit and the trilogy itself. These movies have been hugely successful and are among the top-grossing films of all time. 20 years prior to Peter Jackson's movies, an animated version of the series was directed by Ralph Bakshi. This adaptation was an accurate and honest interpretation of the books and were enjoyed by a huge audience. Another media The Lord of the Rings inspired was gaming and video gaming. In 1974, 20 years after The Lord of the Rings was published, Gary Gygax created the phenomenon of Dungeons and Dragons. This is a dice-rolling role-playing game that has players control characters inside a world inspired by Middle-earth, and include races used in The Lord of the Rings, like elves, orcs, and dwarves. It was the first kind of experience that gave players the opportunity to enter a new and different world rather than just reading about it. This adaptation led to a more modern-day one called World of Warcraft. This is essentially a video game version of the original tabletop Dungeons and Dragons, and has hit over 12 million players at one point, making it a worldwide success. Another medium that was influenced by Tolkien's work was music. Led Zeppelin has several songs that contain references to the series, such as Ramble On and The Battle of Evermore. Other artists include Rush, Black Sabbath, and Leonard Nimoy with his famous Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. As a final example for how much The Lord of the Rings has influenced modern fantasy, I'd like to point out the many similarities that it shares with Harry Potter. Even though they have 2 very different settings, a journey across a world on one side and a school for wizards on the other, characters from both series can almost be directly related to characters from the other series. For a few examples, Frodo Baggins and Harry Potter are the main characters of their respective books. They are both sucked into a new world that they've never experienced before, and they have to learn to adapt and face a Dark Lord in the end. Samwise Gamgee and Ron Weasley are the protagonists' loyal companions throughout their hardships. Merry and Pippin, the troublesome hobbits, relate rather well to Fred and George Weasley, and serve as almost comedic relief from the weight of their corresponding situation. Gandalf and Dumbledore are the wise wizards that care for and guide the young heroes through their adventure, and Gollum and Dobby are just creepy. The Harry Potter books have sold over 400 million copies worldwide. Harry Potter has been this successful while employing so many of the concepts that The Lord of the Rings presented 50 years ago. This is testimony to the fact that Tolkien's original ideas are still used and loved by millions of people. And I would personally like to thank Tolkien for giving the fantasy genre and literature in general such incredible inspiration to become what it has today. Thank you, and I hope everyone here today understands what I'm talking about.